Look at the weather.
It's beautiful here.
Non-stop rain.
Oh, man, it is a blazer out there.
It's cold and it's shivery.
It is cold.
Really coming down here.
I really enjoy your weather reports.
From the All Indiana Podcast Network, we're talking weather in a whole new way. From historical events to what's coming up, plus weather news, science, safety, fun facts, and more.
I like where this is going.
This is Weather Weekly. Weather Weekly with Wish TV Storm Track 8 meteorologist Marcus Bailey.
It is episode number 37 of Weather Weekly. Good to have you along. I'm meteorologist Marcus Bailey from Wish TV in Indianapolis, as we are on this last week of October. Starting to feel a little bit like that too. And we'll talk about the forecast here coming up at the end of the podcast, but finally starting to see some temperatures cooling, especially in the overnights. And so I noticed a little bit. I was out of town over the weekend. Actually went down to Nashville, Tennessee, and noticed a little bit of color. I mean, it's still really late, and we talked about that a couple weeks ago, the fall foliage, why it's been so delayed. But I think now that we're getting some colder weather in here, that we are starting to see the change taking place. You knew it was going to happen. The days are getting shorter, and so we're starting to see some color pop. And we're hopeful, as long as we don't get any really windy conditions here coming up, that those leaves are going to hold a little bit, and we should see some really, really, really vibrant colors here since we've been so wet here, especially as of late, which that kind of leads us into the weather headlines here for this last week of October. I want to begin locally here with just the immense amount of rain that we've had here to open up the week. Started on Sunday and carried over into early Monday morning, and we picked up well over 2 inches of rainfall in a lot of spots. Some areas saw 3 inches of rain. Yeah, it was a soaker. Some really steady and at times heavy downpours across our area. It's interesting to note too. Now, as of we're recording this on Monday morning, so on the 25th of October. I know this will drop on the 27th, but as we're recording this, and we may tack on a little bit more, but I don't think a whole lot more. When I left work, it was 6.81 inches of rainfall for the entire month of October, which is good for the 6th wettest on record. There are a couple of spots that are within reach that we could crack into at least the top 5. I believe we have to get to kind of like 7.04 to get into the top 5. To get into the top 3, I think we need to be at around 7.25 or pretty close to that. So definitely within reach. We do have some rain chances later on into the week. So you pick up a quick quarter to half an inch of rainfall, and right there, I don't think, unless we just get some crazy rain, we'd need probably another 1.5 to 2 inches of rainfall to get into the top spot. So I don't think that is within reach. It's actually closer to 9 inches of rainfall for the wettest October on record. So, but it does go to show how unusually wet this October has been, and those of you you've been paying attention because we've been so warm. I mean, we're mowing the grass. I made the joke on Friday. I went golfing with some buddies, and I made the joke that the grass was greener here in late October than it was in April. Just a lot of the golf courses are just in immense, spectacular shape. Usually this time of year, they start kind of drying out a little bit, and they're kind of beat up from, a full season of golf. But no, they're in wonderful shape here. And hopefully that will lead into a really, really good start to the season and the spring. Hey, who knows? Maybe we can sneak in a little bit of golf during the winter months, too, if we can get some mild days ahead of us. So locally, that's kind of the big story. Obviously, the big story here, and this is what's going to be the body of the podcast for today. I want to get into kind of these buzzwords that you've probably been hearing about: the bomb cyclone and the atmospheric river. And it did cause some problems out in California. Now, it did help to end some of the wildfires, or at least aid in kind of containing a lot of the wildfires that have been taking place out in California. But a lot of areas like Sacramento and San Francisco had daily rainfall records broken. Some areas picked up over 5 or 6 inches of rainfall. And as they go into Monday, some of these areas have picked up a month's worth of precip in about a 24-hour stretch. So it has caused some problems. You think of the wildfires that have been going, everything's burned up, and now you've got this immense amount of rain. Mudslides is going to be the big concern. Obviously, you're going to have some flooding too, but mudslides are going to be a big concern with that because of all the rain, and then you've got the wildfires and everything like that. So it's kind of a good news catch-22 a little bit out there. It's good helping contain some of those fires. Bad because it's going to create some big problems. And then on top of that, they're getting like 40 to 60 mile per hour winds because it wasn't just a lot of rain that came in. It was also some pretty gusty winds, a pretty wound up system. So we're going to talk more about kind of the what. Because there was the two terms, the bomb cyclone, the atmospheric river, and it was a combination of two things that made this kind of a unique event that we'll talk about. It's not a rare event. It is sometimes rare when you get both of them combined, but obviously it got a lot of buzz, especially if you're listening to us and you're from the Indy area and you're a Colts fan because the Colts played out in Santa Clara, San Francisco area, and played the 49ers on Sunday Night Football, and that was a big storyline. And if you watch that game, it was miserable, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Otherwise, the other big story here was the severe weather that took place in the plains or the eastern plains, the western Midwest, kind of depending on where you look at it here. There was a couple tornadoes that were confirmed in Missouri and Illinois. Fortunately, it didn't look like there was any injuries or fatalities recorded with that, but this was the same system that brought us a lot of rain here in central Indiana early Monday morning. Kind of came in a couple of ways. We had the steady rain on Sunday, and then the cold front actually moved through early Monday morning, and luckily the timing kind of worked out that it moved through basically between around 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., and so the storms really lost a lot of their luster. There was a lot of thunder, there was a lot of lightning. There were some gustier winds, but they were well below severe limits, so we didn't actually have any severe thunderstorm warnings or anything worse than that out of that cold front moving on through. Tropics remain to be fairly quiet here, and we're kind of getting on the tail end of hurricane season that will end in November. We really haven't had anything significant as of late, and as I'm looking right now, there's no anticipated tropical cyclone development in the next 48 hours in the Atlantic. We do have Hurricane Rick right now in the eastern Pacific. It has made landfall in western Mexico, west central Mexico, and doesn't look like it's going to play a big role in the outlook across the lower 48 states as of right now. It's very slowly going to move through the central portions of Mexico here, so heavy rain is what's going to be kind of the main concern. They obviously have some pretty strong winds that are dialed in with Rick as of right now. As time of recording this, it's got 70 knot winds, I should say, 80 mile per hour sustained winds. So that's a pretty strong hurricane there. But it's only moving north at about 9 miles per hour. Central Pacific, nothing to out toward the Hawaiian Islands, so we're in good shape there. So again, we're kind of quieting things down here over the Atlantic, which is what we'd like to see here. And hopefully we can stay quiet as we get kind of on the tail end of tropical development season. All right, quick break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about those buzzwords. We're going to piggyback off of kind of things that you've been probably picking up on. That storm that hit out west, the bomb cyclone, the atmospheric river. What are those? How unique are those? And can we see those kind of things here in the Midwest, specifically in central Indiana? We'll talk more about that next here on Weather Weekly.
Audible's romance collection has something to satisfy every side of you. When it comes to what kind of romance you're into, you don't have to choose just one. Fancy a dalliance with a duke, or maybe a steamy billionaire. You could find a book boyfriend in the city and another one tearing it up on the hockey field. And if nothing on this earth satisfies, you can always find love in another realm. Discover modern rom-coms from authors like Lily Chu and Ali Hazelwood, the latest romantasy series from Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, plus Regency favorites like Bridgerton and Outlander. And of course, all the really steamy stuff. Your first great love story is free when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Wondery. That's audible.com/Wondery.
All right, episode number 37 here, and I was kind of debating on which direction I wanted to go with this week's podcast, and then this weekend happened, and we got these buzz terms that kind of went out, and if you've listened to this podcast long enough, I like to tie indie sports in with weather. And so Colts were playing out in San Francisco, Sunday Night Football, big game. They got a great win. The big story with that, and Charlie Clifford was out there, our sports reporter, does a great job. One of the first tweets he had, and he talked about the crazy weather that they were going to be dealing with going into that game. I also talked to my boss, Al Carl, who's our news director here at Wish TV, big into like fitness things and stuff like that, and he pays attention. He's got a close group of friends that jump in and do the Ironman, and they have those kind of sporadic all over the country, but they had this past weekend an Ironman in San Francisco, and for those of you that aren't aware of this, Ironman is not cheap to compete in. Not only is it extremely grueling and difficult on the body, but it is super expensive to compete in those day-long races. Not to mention, the travel, because they're not in every city. We had one not that long ago that was up in Muncie, Indiana. But a lot of times, this was the first one they've had in Indiana, and maybe ever, but certainly in a long time. A lot of these people have to bounce around, and there was somebody that actually trekked across the country by car, one of my boss's friends by car, and went out to San Francisco to drive, only to find out the day of the race that they were canceling it. But that's kind of impacted that system had. So what am I talking about? If you don't know what I'm talking about, there were two terms that were very buzzworthy. And I kind of make fun of news departments, especially the national news, because they jump on these buzzwords that have been around forever. I think back to polar vortex. If we all remember that was a big thing back in the early 2000s, where we had that one brutal winter where we just had an immense amount of snow and just ridiculous cold to follow. And that was the word. That was the polar vortex. The polar vortex is not a new thing. It's always been there. It will always be there. But it was something that I think the national media kind of latched onto, saw that, the Weather Service had, dubbed that this was going to be a kind of a polar vortex event, and the national media just ran with it. And we know, especially with social media and how it goes, the buzzwords are what, kind of drives traffic on social media. It gets the likes, it gets the shares, and it drives people to websites. Okay, so it's a little inside baseball. It's not inaccurate at all, but I think that there's a lack of context when you get to that kind of situation where you're using the buzzwords. People think of it like a hurricane, you know what I mean? Or like it's an extremely rare event. So the same thing kind of happened here this past weekend on the West Coast, and it was two separate buzzwords, but all referring to the same system. You heard bomb cyclone, which we've heard several times. But the first time I've heard the national media kind of jump on board with this one was atmospheric river. Okay. So you had kind of the combination of both of those. It all came out of the same system. So first, let's talk about what an atmospheric river is. And it's kind of what you would think if you're thinking, and you have to think of the atmosphere three-dimensionally, right? Because it's not just what's happening at the surface. So this isn't it's not a legit river that's pumping in a lot of moisture here. It is something that's happening in the atmosphere and is pulling in all of this moisture, okay? You can easily see this on water vapor imagery. Yeah, and if I've lost you here, there's there's different kinds of imagery that we show. We refer to it as satellite, right? And it's typically when we're showing cloud cover. But there's different forms that you look at the satellites depending on what you're wanting to achieve in telling the story. A visible satellite is basically, it's a camera, okay? So it gives you kind of a higher resolution. But the problem is you can only use it during the daytime hours. Once it's dark, you don't see the clouds. So then we flip over to infrared or IR imagery, when we are in nighttime events. You can also pick up some of the water vapor and such with the IR. For me as a morning meteorologist, because I spend a lot of the hours talking when it's dark out, I don't get a chance to use visible satellite imagery very often, especially this time of year because your nights are so much longer. So you're usually stuck using the infrared. Then the other channel is water vapor. Those are kind of the three main ones. There's several other different ones that you can use, especially with the new GOES satellites. But water vapor is another one. And water vapor kind of works as like infrared. You can use it any time of day. But it will show you the moisture or the lack thereof, depending on the color table that you use, in the atmosphere. And so when you were watching, if you're kind of a weather nerd and you jump on to look at water vapor in this instance, you saw kind of this big spiral, right? Spinning system that was approaching the West Coast, and then it had a long trail on it that fed out way out into the Pacific Ocean. So this is your atmospheric river, okay? So basically what it was is you had this storm system, which ended up being a bomb cyclone, which I'll talk next about. But you have a storm complex. It has to be attached to something, and then it is getting fed all of this moisture. So where was that moisture coming from? It was coming from the Pacific Ocean. And so that is where atmospheric river comes from, because it was a river essentially of moisture that is now getting fed into the storm system that then was in turn dumping the rain and in some higher elevation snow along the Pacific coast, specifically into California, but also into Oregon and Washington as well. And it's now sneaking into parts of Nevada and a lot of the Rockies and all that other stuff. So they're going to be dealing with some of the rain and snow there. So a term that we always used in our meteorology classes with Dr. Arnold was, especially for these West Coast systems specifically, we'd call it the Pineapple Express. The reason why we called it the Pineapple Express is because you would see this big spiraling of this area of low pressure, and then you'd see that connected river basically that would extend for hundreds of miles to the south and west, and it would usually go back to just east of Hawaii. What's Hawaii known for? Pineapples. So it was the Pineapple Express, where you'd get this, moisture that's getting fed into this system. So now what's interesting and what was a little bit different than other times, a lot of times these systems, and probably why this term atmospheric river became so buzzworthy is because it was connected to a bomb cyclone. Usually these storm complexes are relatively weak, okay? Now they can dump an immense amount of rain. And we saw that in California. We talked about in the headlines. They got a month's worth of rain in a 24-hour stretch. The other problem with these kind of systems is they usually aren't very fast moving. So not only does it contain a lot of water, but it's not moving very quickly. And so that's where you get the problems. But it's also beneficial. And again, we talked about this is wildfire season for, the West Coast. And up until this point, they've had little to no help from Mother Nature in helping to fight those fires. If you look at the drought monitor, and you can check that if you just Google search drought monitor, it'll take you to the Climate Prediction Center's drought monitor page. You will see that the western half of the country, but specifically those states along the West Coast, where they've been dealing with wildfires are in an extremely dry period. They're in an extreme drought. And so you need something like this to kind of help bust that up, right? We talk all the time about how droughts kind of feed on themselves. Well, you need a system like this. It's almost like a pseudo hurricane. It wasn't in that magnitude, and there's distinct differences, which I'll talk about in a second. But this was something that you needed to kind of help bust that drought. Now, they're still going to be well below average, but this will aid at least in a lot of the personnel out there and first responders to kind of get those wildfires under control. Some interesting stats about this. This comes straight from NOAA's page, so I'm going to read this directly. All right. So just some fun facts about atmospheric rivers. And again, these are not unusual. They're not unique. They don't happen, every day. They don't happen every week. In fact, they don't even happen every month. I wouldn't call them rare, but they're not frequent either. Okay. So these are some of the fun facts here that NOAA's put out in an infographic here. So a strong atmospheric river transports an amount of water vapor roughly equivalent to 7.5 to 15 times the average flow of water at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So you're thinking about the mouth. It's wide. You get to the mouth down around, just south of New Orleans. That's a lot of water, right? So that shows you how much water is actually going in vapor form. That eventually will then turn into either liquid or frozen precipitation, depending on the temperature. ARs, or atmospheric rivers, are a primary feature in the entire global water cycle and are tied closely to both water supply and flood risk, particularly in the western United States. Now, on average, about 30 to 50% of annual precipitation on the West Coast occurs in just a few AR events and contributes to the water supply and flooding risk. Did you get that number? 30 to 50%. So, these are the big, over half, almost a half of the rain that they see in the West Coast comes from these AR events. They can be 250 to 375 miles wide, and ARs move with the weather and are present somewhere on the Earth on any given time. So there's always something here. Now, scientists' improved understandings of AR has come from roughly a decade of scientific study that use observations from satellites, radar, and aircraft, as well as the latest numerical weather models. There are more studies underway, including a 2015 scientific mission that added data from instruments aboard a NOAA ship, so out in the ocean, floating around. I think it's also important to note, too, we talk about the bad that happened with this one specific event, but they are also extremely beneficial. They can, they're responsible for a large quantity of rain that can produce flooding, and in California's instance, because of the wildfires, mudslides. Those are the two big concerns with this. But it is beneficial in creating snowpacks in the higher elevations. A series of atmospheric rivers fueled the strong winter storms that hit the U.S. West Coast back in 2010. It produced 11 to 25 inches of rain in certain areas. Those rivers also contributed to a snowpack in the Sierras, which received 75% of its annual snowfall by December 22nd, which was the first full day of winter, by the way. So that was a beneficial thing. They were already had a really good start to the winter. So that has its own benefits there and just helping to promote the water cycle. We spend a lot of time with the West Coast, but I think it's also important to note that atmospheric rivers are not only a West Coast thing. We will get systems that can be classified as atmospheric river. If it's a really strong one, you can get atmospheric rivers from the Pacific Ocean still getting pumped in here into the Midwest. But more often than not, if we get something that is connected, it's coming from the Gulf. I think if you ever hear us mention and we use the term the Gulf of Mexico is wide open. You get more of a southerly flow, and we get these kind of in the spring or the summer, where we'll say the Gulf of Mexico is wide open. That means our humidity is getting higher. You're getting more of a moisture supply, and you can get some of these systems that will draw in more moisture. But I also think it's worth a note where we may have a greater impact on this is during winter weather. There are essentially two types of winter systems that we get here in the Midwest. We get what we dub as Alberta clippers, and what I've known to be called as panhandle hooks, originating in the panhandle of Texas. The more frequent ones that we get are Alberta clippers. They originate from Alberta, Canada, so to our north and west, and they come over land. So there's no moisture connection with those. They usually, it's kind of your really, really cold snow. You don't get a ton of snow out of it. You can if they're not real fast moving, but typically they are fast moving, and then you usually get a punch of really cold air back behind that system. The big snows that we pick up on here in the Midwest, and you can think most recently was last year on Valentine's Day when we picked up over 10 inches of snow. That was a true panhandle hook type of storm system where we kind of got on the warm side for a little bit, and then this system really gathered up some strength and was able to draw a lot of moisture in from the Gulf, and was able to, we ended up getting on the cold sector eventually, and just at the right time, all of that moisture from the Gulf coincided with the cold air that was rushing in, and that's why we ended up getting 10 inches plus of snow that day. You have to keep in mind, you want to get into physics here, that warm air is able to hold more moisture than cold air does, which is why those Alberta clippers usually don't contain a ton of moisture. Now, you can get in, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but that's when you start getting in, why can we still pick up, 5, 6, 7 inches of snow with a clipper? Well, that's when you start getting into your snowfall ratios. The colder the temperatures get, the higher the snowfall ratio goes. Typically, if it's 32 degrees or a little bit cooler than that, say anywhere between 28 and 32 out, your snow ratio is probably going to be around 10 to 1, right? So for every 1 inch of rainfall or liquid equivalent, you get 10 inches of snow. Well, you get these Alberta clippers, you could be talking about a 15 to 1 ratio, or even in extreme cases, a 20 to 1 or a 31 ratio, because those systems don't hold as much moisture, so it doesn't take as much to create the thump of snow there is. Does it make sense? So, but that are big systems where we typically get the heavy wet snow like we had on Valentine's Day in 2020, that would be coming from kind of an atmospheric river event. Okay, so hopefully that made a little bit of sense to you. You need that connection to some sort of water source to help pump in all of that moisture here. And then once it gets cut off, you don't have that supply anymore. All right, so that's the atmospheric river. So that's one part of this story. The other part was bomb cyclone. We've heard about this. This term's been used frequently over the last few years, and it usually will pertain to nor'easters, and you'll hear it in different terms. Bomb cyclone, I think, has been kind of the more popular term as of late, but you might hear it as bomb cyclogenesis, where basically what ends up happening is you have an area of low pressure that deepens very quickly. In a easier term to understand, it's a system that is strengthening rapidly in a 24-hour period. Now, I guess the words, both bomb and cyclone are buzzwords, but they're not they're not made up terms. I think that's the one thing I want to kind of drive home here. These are terms that are, if you take a basic meteorology course, these are terms that you're going to learn. Cyclogenesis or cyclogenesis, however you want to call about it, or a bomb cyclone is a legit thing. It can pertain to systems like what we had on the West Coast. It can pertain to hurricanes, because I think the thing that you need to keep in mind are all cyclones are kind of created the same in that they all spin in the northern hemisphere counterclockwise. And if you're kind of picturing, if you're looking overhead, right? And if I was able to draw, I'm trying to do this on a non-visual medium here on, podcast. But if you're looking overhead and I were to draw you a diagram and we show you, areas of low pressure, everything goes counterclockwise and in to that area of low pressure, as opposed to a high pressure where everything goes clockwise and out. Low pressures are referred to as cyclones. High pressures are referred to as anticyclones. Okay, they're completely opposite. And that's where you get your fair and settled weather. Hurricanes are they are cyclones. They are a system that goes counterclockwise and in, right? It goes in toward the eye. So that's what all these systems have in common. They all do the same thing. Obviously, hurricanes get stronger in a sense because they're fueled by the warm ocean water and other factors too. So what ends up happening, and we see this probably more often in the winter, and I think that this is why this situation was a little bit more unique, was that it happened in October and not in, the middle of winter, where you do get some kind of extreme fluctuations. And it's easier for what we would call these things to bomb out. So basically the definition here is that these cyclones, let me put it this way first. So we measure everything with pressure here. Going back to what I originally said, low pressure, high pressure, right? Well, what does that mean? So the typical surface air pressure is about 1,000 millibars. Technically it's 1010 millibars, okay? 1,010 millibars. And I know we don't usually use millibars in TV terms. We use inches, barometric pressure, right? We'll say 29.25 inches. But in the weather world, since day one that I got into meteorology classes, everything is measured in millibars, because it's not only the pressure that you're going by with storms, but you're also talking elevation and the millibars there. That's when we look at our forecast models and we look at the 850 millibar level, the 500 millibar level, the 300 millibar level, and so on. Anyway, don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but going back to the average millibars, 1010. So typical storms, that we get here, for instance, the storm that we had here in central Indiana Sunday into Monday, typically at like 995 or 990 millibars, okay? But for a bomb cyclone isn't ranked by that initial number, okay? What it is judged by, and what will classify it as it bombing out, is the term we would use, is it has to drop at least, or a minimum of 24 millibars in 24 hours. Sometimes we'll use the term it's deepening. The low pressure is deepening. Okay? So that's what ended up happening with this system. As it approached land, it got stronger in a hurry. And so that's where you get bomb cyclone. Now, why was that important? So when a storm strengthens this quickly, it's a signal of how much air is being drawn into the storm's spin or the circulation, okay? And as I mentioned, all of that not only spins counterclockwise, but it goes inward toward the center, and it rises and exits through the top. Okay? If more air is leaving the storm than is sucked inward, the pressure falls even more and the system will continue to grow. So it's basically a machine until something actually cuts that off. It's not, and again, this kind of goes to what I said about atmospheric rivers. They're not rare, but they don't happen frequently either. Okay? That term is what's called bombogenesis. That's the official meteorological term. That's not a, buzzword that the news or weather people have tried to make up to make it sound more fearful or whatever. That's a legit meteorological term. And that's how it happens. Now, they're more common with nor'easters. I think kind of a prime example of that would be, and I cannot stand this term, but it's what it's dubbed as, so I'm going to refer to it as it, is Superstorm Sandy. Now, that one was a little bit more unique because that originally was a hurricane at one point. And then it weakened to a point that the Hurricane Center was no longer giving updates on what was Sandy. Okay, and I think that's where sometimes we lose people because they're like, well, why do we still call it Sandy if it's no longer a hurricane? And what dubbed it a superstorm? Superstorm was not a weather term. Okay, that was something that was ended up being given to this because they could no longer call it Hurricane Sandy. They couldn't call it Tropical Storm Sandy. Basically, what it was a post-tropical storm or post-tropical system Sandy. That doesn't sound nearly as impressive on the news as saying Superstorm Sandy. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit sense. But basically what ends up happening on these nor'easters is you'll get this low that will ride up the East Coast, and as it approaches the New England states, it bombs out. It will deepen rapidly as it approaches the New England states. And then a lot of times it'll suck down that cold air from Canada, and that's where you get some of the big snows in places like D.C. and Philadelphia and Boston and New York City. That's where the majority of their big snow systems come from. They don't necessarily have to ride up the eastern seaboard. They could be a system that originated, in the plains or through the Midwest, and then they end up bombing out over New England. Same thing, though, and same thing applies. But I think it's also important to note that there is also that moisture connection a lot of times with those bomb cyclones, if you will, coming into New England, where they may be either connected to the Gulf or, depending on where it's riding up, it could be connected to the Atlantic. There's some sort of moisture supply connection or that atmospheric river that we were just talking about. So that's kind of the definition of the bomb cyclones. Now, what you will also see with those, when you get a deepening area of low pressure like that, just like a hurricane, they become then a very wind-driven machine. And so that was kind of the combining factor with this atmospheric river and the bomb cyclone. It wasn't that the bomb cyclone was in itself something major. It would have created some issues. Even if it weren't connected to the moisture, it would have dumped some rain, not nearly as much without the atmospheric river. But I think the big story, if you separate the two, was the bomb cyclone was creating 40 to 60 mile per hour winds. And then in addition to that, it was dumping 5 to 6 inches of rain. So if you watch the Sunday night football game out in Santa Clara with the Colts and the Niners, you saw it was miserable. I think that second quarter was probably the worst out of all of it, where they were kind of in the core of it, and it was just driving rain, and it was raining sideways. It was rough. It was really, really tough conditions. So it was the combination of both of those that, made this kind of a little more, again, I don't want to say rare, but a unique event that doesn't happen often. You had the combination of both. And so that's why both of those were noteworthy. And you'll hear after the break here that this system will play a role in our forecast later on into the week. We're going to get some rain from this bomb cyclone, atmospheric river, whatever you want to call it. But it will not have nearly the potency that it had Sunday night and Monday out on the West Coast for two reasons. One, you're not going to have this deep area of low pressure holding strong. It's not going to get stronger as it moves over the continental U.S. So it's going to be a weaker system already by the time it reaches us. And two, it's not going to have the connection to water or a water supply to dump a lot of rain. Now, that said, it still has a lot of moisture in the atmosphere. It's not fighting against a lot of dry air to help shred that apart. So we will have those rain chances late in the week, as we typically do. All of our storms, or not all, but majority of our storms originate from the West Coast, right? Everything in the lower 48, for the most part, unless there's a unique circumstance, originates from west to east. And so that's not unique. But what is unique is just this kind of system here. And it is holding strong enough together that we'll get some of that rain here. But just kind of some terms that I wanted to bring to your attention. It always seems like once these kind of things hit the mainstream, that it gets used a little bit more frequently. We hear about the polar vortex pretty much every winter now, right? I've heard bomb cyclone over the last couple of winters specifically. And now I think atmospheric river, that might be something that is going to kind of get thrown into it. And I'm all for it. But one, want to make sure the public is educated. Bomb cyclone, you think of cyclone, you think hurricane. Bomb, you're thinking pretty bad. Bomb's not a great word, right? So, unfortunately, it could be used in scaring people because that is the news business. Unfortunately, that's the business we're in. It is an attention grabber, and I'm not saying personally that this is right. If it were up to me, I would have worded things a little bit differently. Maybe if I get into the body of an article, I start using those kind of terms. But in the headline, I'm not saying bomb cyclone impacts millions, without any context, because there needs to be some context here. This is something that is not unusual in either both the atmospheric river or the bomb cyclone. But again, get the national media grabbing hold of it. That's what ends up happening, especially when you get people that probably don't know a lot about weather and they look at these terms and they think, ooh, that looks super clickbaity. And so they jump all over it. And that's kind of where we're at there. Again, not terms that are made up. They are real. We're not making those things up. But I think it's important to have the context to what they actually mean before you kind of dive in too deep on, whoa, is this a rare event or that kind of thing. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit on what happened. It is still extremely fascinating. If you're a weather lover, it's an event that was really cool. It was neat to watch unfold on satellite and radar. Hopefully it doesn't create too many problems out west here over the next day or so. But again, just one of those kind of interesting weather phenomena. If you're a big weather nerd, it's something that is cool. And hopefully, people get more. I'm all for if people want to get more interested in the weather, and you're using terms like this, and that's where it's going to draw them to, that's where we're headed. I'm all for that. I think it's more knowledge is a good thing when it comes to weather, because look, whether you are a science geek like I am, or if you're just a casual person, it's going to impact you one way or the other. It's why weather is such a popular segment in newscasts. Everybody wants to know what the weather is, whether you love weather or not. You need to know what you need to wear appropriately for the day, if your plans are going to get rained out or snowed out or anything like that. So if this is going to draw a little bit more people in to the fold a little bit and educate people, then I'm all for it. We'll talk about how this bomb cyclone and atmospheric river could impact our forecast here later in the week. That's coming up next here on Weather Weekly. All right, here's a look at your forecast here for the last week of October. And boy, has it been a very wet start to this week. Obviously, Sunday, the rain. Monday, we dealt with the rain and then the falling temperatures. And then we kind of dried out for Tuesday, and now heading into Wednesday, lots of sunshine. Got to watch this next system here Thursday and Friday. This is going to be kind of the remnants of the system we were just talking about that hit California. It's a slow mover across the lower 48, and it will provide rain. Now, it's going to be cut off from that moisture that we were talking about, that atmospheric river, so it's not going to be pulling in the moisture that they had in the Pacific. But there's still a lot of moisture to go around. Think of it kind of like tropical systems that we get coming out of the Gulf, and we get, some of those tropical downpours when the remnants of maybe a hurricane or a tropical storm impact Texas or Louisiana or Mississippi and kind of right up to the north. They end up not as potent maybe as what they were in terms of rainfall. Sure, rainfall, because it's not connected to that water source anymore. And that's how I think that's going to play out here for Thursday and Friday. But we could see another quarter to half an inch of rainfall, maybe on the high end of things. So that's just going to tick up the charts here in terms of where we stand for wettest Octobers on record. So that's something worth watching. Heading into the weekend here, it looks like we're going to be relatively quiet for the most part. I do have some shots for rain on Sunday. That's still a ways out. I know trick-or-treating goes on Sunday night. Be prepared that there may be some showers to dodge. Numbers don't look all that bad. We certainly have had colder Halloweens here in central Indiana. I've got highs near 60, which would, lead to probably low to mid 50s when you're out trick-or-treating. It'll be cool, but not uncomfortably cold for the kiddos there on Sunday night. And then looking ahead to next week, just looking ahead to the Climate Prediction Center's temperature and precip outlook, good shot for slightly below average temperatures over the next 6 to 10 day period and below average precipitation. That's a good thing after we've been so soggy. And the 8 to 14 day outlook, which will take us into that first week of November, says below average temperatures and below average precipitation. By the way, we kind of kick off the month of November, averaging highs right around 60, maybe slightly below that into the upper 50s. So we may be talking about a little bit more of a chill in the air overall for that first week in November, but I don't see anything substantial that's going to be really, really, really cold here as we get going into the next couple of weeks. The November outlook is out now from the Weather Service. They are calling for above average temperatures for the month and equal chances for above or below average precipitation as we head into the month of November as well. So we will wait and see how that will play out. Thank you so much for spending some time here with us here on the podcast. We always love to hear your feedback on what you'd like to hear. You can shoot me an email anytime, marcus.bailey@wishtv.com. You can also find me on social media, Marcus Bailey Weather on Facebook or on Twitter and Instagram. Just search at Marcus Bailey. Hope you have a good week. We will talk to you again in November. And while you're here, make sure to check out all the other great podcasts right here on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Discover more from Storm Track 8 Weather and Wish TV. Online at wishtv.com and when you follow Wish TV on Facebook. Plus, be sure to check out more great podcasts from the All Indiana Podcast Network now at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.